Good morning. I'm Sarah Pritchard, UK Managing Director of Bureau Happold and Chair of the Net Zero Task Force, which was set up to bring ACE and EIC members together to outline a carbon-free future for our industry and society. We're delighted to share our first report, which is a result of the year's work by the task force, and which we originally intended to launch at COP26 in Glasgow. Obviously, we're unable to do that today because of the virus, but we're delighted to be with you virtually. We have a great lineup of speakers who are joining us, and we'll have plenty of opportunity for what I hope will be a lively discussion in the course of the morning. As we battle towards the end of 2020, and it has been quite a battle due to the major impact that the COVID pandemic has had in our lives, there's been a lot of talk around the fact that things will feel quite different by the spring of 2021. Notwithstanding all of this, much of it unpredictable, we know that climate change remains the defining challenge of our time, and that we have a long way to go to achieve the CCC target set in May 2019, that the UK should achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. As we emerge from the pandemic, we have a chance to take stock and to ensure that we don't just return to doing exactly what we did in the pre-pandemic world. As individuals and businesses, as consultants in the construction and environmental sector, we need to ensure that what we do firmly establishes us on this path to net zero. The ACE and the EIC set up the Net Zero Task Force at the end of 2020 to ensure that we were able to support members in taking the steps necessary to meet the great challenges of climate change. After all, buildings and the construction industry itself are major contributors to the emission of greenhouse gases. Engineering consultants have a major role to play in changing client perceptions and material specifications in order to shift the dial in this area. I've been honest from the outset, I'm not an expert in climate change with an environmental background. I haven't personally worked on very many green building projects, but I know as a business leader in engineering consultancy that we all have work to do in facing up to net zero. And this is why I'm particularly pleased to chair this task force and to bring together the best of the inputs of the ACE and EIC's membership to understand the practical challenges and how we might respond to them. We've seen some positive announcements from the PM in the last couple of weeks, talking about cutting carbon emissions by 68% by 2030. But we need that to be matched with a clearer policy framework and a better way of delivering projects. We need policies and plans now to match these ambitions. Our task force has thought hard about what policy framework might look like and about what we'd need to do as engineers and consultants to make all of our projects net zero. Our sector has unique problem-solving skills and can imagine and develop innovative approaches to resolve these issues. However, we need to confirm what are the project level or policy issues standing in our way, and start to find ways to resolve these with government, between ourselves, and in support of our clients. Now, in terms of housekeeping for this morning's webinar, can I ask that if you have questions, and we would like to have a good discussion after our speakers have given their short presentations, can you go to the chat function in the control panel, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. Don't worry, we'll also answer we haven't had time to cover after the webinar if there's lots of those. You can ask your questions anonymously if you wish, and don't worry if you miss anything, as we'll be uploading this to the ACE and EIC websites, so you can listen to us again if you want to. It's one of the great things we were talking about beforehand, about the fact so many more people will be able to join us at these webinars because they're virtual, and we haven't now had to travel to London or to Glasgow, indeed, to hear these talks. Finally, just to note, we've got an hour and 15 minutes today, so there's plenty of time for discussion and debate. And with that, I'd like to hand over now to Matthew Farrow, who's Director of Policy at the ACE and EIC, and he's been coordinating the activity of the task force. He's presenting the report findings. Once Matthew is finished, I'll pass the baton over to some brief words from Tim Chapman of Arup, Dr. Louise Carver, formerly of the University of Lancaster, and input to the report will talk to us then, and we'll get a useful client perspective from Daniel Johns of Anglican Water. And together at the end, as I said, they'll answer any questions you might have. So please do share those questions via the chat function. Okay, Matthew, over to you, please.
Thank you, Sarah. And I should thank you as well, actually, for taking on the task of chairing the task force and steering the work exceptionally well. And also my thanks to the several hundred AC and EIC members who've contributed to the work, either through being on the task force or taking part in the survey or attending the workshops that we've run. As Sarah said, I'm going to set out some of the main messages and findings of the report. But just before I start doing that, I think it is worth just taking a step back and recognising what a crucial moment this is for climate policy. As Sarah said, we have COP26, a delayed COP26, only a year away, a little bit under a year away, a hugely important sort of milestone. We have a Prime Minister who's made clear that he wants a green legacy as part of his domestic priorities and has started to say some much more ambitious things about climate change. And we have, I think, some pretty widespread appetite among mainstream business leaders for more action and faster action on net zero. So a really important moment, but I think also just worth reflecting that there's probably been two previous moments that I would say a little bit similar to this in the last 30 years of UK climate policy. Back in 1989, Margaret Thatcher made a very powerful speech to the UN, a wake-up call that we needed to take climate change as an issue seriously. And then again, perhaps in 2005-06, Tony Blair really prioritised the issue, both internationally and here at home, and set up the Climate Change Act. And for various reasons, the momentum on those two previous occasions was lost, and we never really had the step change and moving up through the gears that we needed. So I think it's hugely important that as a sector and as a country, we don't let this moment slip through. So in terms of the report, the theme of the report is how ready are we to adopt net zero pathways? And we looked at this in three particular ways. Is government policy framework ready to deliver that ambition? Secondly, are built environment sectors themselves ready to make net zero projects pretty much standard? And then thirdly, as Sarah's already alluded to, are consultancies and the consultancy sector ready to be the catalyst for change? And in doing this, we thought about the issue very much through the perspective of individual built environment projects, because we all recognise that the net zero environment we're going to have in 2050 is going to be the sum of all those projects between now and then. And of course, not just the new build projects, the flagship projects, but also retrofit, refurbishment, small projects all across the country. And as we all know, as professionals in the sector and people involved in the sector, all projects are affected by a wide range of factors, policy regulatory factors, the market context, the sort of client's desires and business models. And so in doing the work, we've tried hard to think about the ways in which projects are formulated. So first of all, government policy. Probably no great surprise to hear that our conclusion was the government policy framework is not yet there, it's not yet fit for purpose, particularly in terms of the links between the high-level ambition and target, so the CCC advice, which we're going to get an update of tomorrow, the Climate Change Act itself, and then the specific policy and planning regulations that affect projects. Now, I won't say too much about this because I know Tim in his remarks is going to focus on this in quite a bit of detail, but apart from perhaps one or two encouraging signs, the Green Book revision, which now talks about net zero quite explicitly, that came out in the spending review, clearly quite a long way to go. Then secondly, in terms of the individual sectors, so what we did is we asked our member experts across EIC and ACE through the survey work that we did to think about the different Committee on Climate Change pathways that have been identified for the main built environment sectors, and to consider how ready the sectors were to adopt those pathways. And by the sectors, I'm talking about the sort of cluster of companies and professions, so consultants, contractors, asset owners, operators working in these different sectors. And we asked the member experts to rate each sector against the criteria at the top. And as you can see, this is a pretty high-level heat map of the results, but a pretty mixed set of findings, as you might expect. In some sectors, ports, airports, one or two aspects of water perhaps, there are real technology challenges still to be solved. In most sectors, technology is not really the key issue, but what you find in the survey is issues around often business models not being aligned to net zero, or disconnects between different types of regulators, frustrating all the good intentions within a project. What we're very conscious of is to solve and address those problems, you're going to need a lot of very granular policy change and improvement. So of course you need the high level policy and the high level frameworks, but actually very detailed sort of policy change within each of those sectors. Now the report doesn't cover this in its entirety, but in the annex of the report, we've broken it down by sector, and we've given some examples that came up through the workshops that we did or some of the survey work of the sort of specific changes that we think will be needed. And I think over the next year in the run up to COP26, there's going to be a lot of hard thinking and work to be done around making these specific things happen. What we also were struck by, thinking about the context within which projects are taking place, is there's a very live agenda across the sort of broad construction community about trying to transform the way that construction projects in the UK are structured and delivered. Quite a few of these initiatives come from the construction sector deal, and we've listed a few here. So the hugely important work being done by the Construction Innovation Hub around the Value Toolkit, due out in the spring, the Construction Playbook, which I think is going to be released by government today, and the renewed interest in modern methods of construction. And our feeling is these different initiatives, while a lot of them weren't designed specifically from a net zero starting point, actually provide some real opportunities to embed net zero thinking in the way we go about projects, and in a way we just couldn't have done, I think, sort of 5 years ago. Another aspect we're conscious of in terms of how projects are put together and delivered is, I think, the need for a wider recognition of the difference between what's seen right now as good practice, best practice, and the appropriate thing to do, and what we have to start doing to make sure that the projects we're designing and delivering in the 2020s do actually play their part in the 2050 net zero future. And this graphic shows some of the ways we think it's helpful to think about this. This sort of thinking very much in line with the work being done by the Science Based Targets Initiative or bodies like UK Green Building Council. But again, I think the real challenge is this has to be not just for new build projects, not just for flagship projects, but for all the different types of projects, large and small, that our industry works on. And then thirdly, again, as Sarah said, consultancies are a crucial part of this. Consultancies have a unique mix of skills within their organisations, often involved at different parts of a project, from the very early stage optioneering right through, of course, to detailed design, and working with large clients, small clients, public sector clients, private sector clients, so right across the built environment. So absolutely crucial. And I think a big message of the report is aimed at our own members in ACE and EIC consultancy members. And what we've done in the report and in the graphic here is try to set out the specific actions we think the consultancies could take so they are part of the catalyst for change. So first of all, taking a very public stand, perhaps through signing up to initiatives like Pledge to Net Zero, which the IC and AC helped to get off the ground, or the Engineers Declare set of initiatives. Secondly, addressing the skills challenge. I think the days when carbon specialists were brought into projects at a particular time and sat in a particular place in a company are gone or are going, and we need carbon literacy to quite a high level across all disciplines and all parts of the consultancy sector. Thirdly, there's a lot of best practice which is being codified, can be codified, many stakeholders working in this space, and I think important that consultancies play their part in supporting that. And then fourthly, particularly importantly, helping, persuading, encouraging clients to do the right thing. And I'll just flag up the first of the bullet points there. Well, what we're proposing is that consultancies commit to offering clients a net zero compatible design as an option, even if that's perhaps not the client's starting point or their first thought, but as a very tangible way to try and move the debate on. So I'll leave it there, Sarah. Those are the key elements of the report. I hope people will read it in detail, and very interested to hear what the panelists and the audience think of it. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you so very much for taking us through that so comprehensively. As you say, there's a lot coming out of that report, which is really useful. Tim Chapman from Arab, I'd like to introduce you now to talk us through your initial responses to that report. Tim has been part of the task force throughout the last year and has really contributed to its work and to the thought process around it. Tim, if we could hand over to you for a few minutes, please.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to share my screen.
Perfect, thank you.
Whoop. So hang on 2 seconds, apologies. Is that working? Excellent. So hopefully you can see the screen. So I'm delighted to be here, and actually Matthew and team, I'd be hugely congratulating for doing a great job. It's really topical and adds something very distinctive to the marketplace. There's an awful lot of publications coming out, but I think there's an awful lot in this report which is very topical, very on the ball, and specific for consultants, as you'd expect. So I was asked to try and explain a little bit about the policy background to how all of this works. I think the critical thing is to understand that it's a very complicated one and a very fast moving one, and it's therefore actually very difficult to remain current in it. We have things like the Paris Agreement from 2015, which governs what we do in the UK and around the world, in most parts of the world. Hopefully the US will join it in about a month's time. But within the UK, we have a number of organisations which are contributing to this space, all of which produce actually really useful documents, but also which there's some gaps in between. So the National Infrastructure Commission, I mentioned on the left-hand side of this slide, touches on providing government with impartial expert advice on major long-term infrastructure challenges. Ultimately, you might imagine it coming up with sort of a national land use plan for the UK. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority help government deliver projects better. They not just infrastructure projects, but actually defence projects, IT projects, and everything. So it's meant to be about capability and how projects get delivered. They look after the list of projects and they look after that very well. But that, in a way, is a little bit of a non sequitur. It doesn't sit in a way so well with their current remit. And then we have the CCC, which has become very active lately, producing some really good documentation. I think it's really helpful, the steps that they're taking, given the government confidence of what to actually say.
Tim, could you go on to the next slide? I think you're talking about your second slide, aren't you?
Oh, sorry, I've gone on, but maybe it hasn't moved on the presentation. That's interesting. So I'll stop sharing. Sorry again, apologies.
Sorry, I can certainly only see the first one. I think I'm picking up from the chat.
No. Can you see that? I should go on my second slide now, hopefully.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think
actually, you may need to stop me on my third slide as well, but I only got three. But feel free to let me know.
Thank you.
Sorry, and the CCC, which is the third major government quango, which has been hugely activist lately and has done some really good work giving government confidence in what to do. Against all of these, we also have the national policy statements where government take set policy according to what the government wants to achieve based on advice they get from other places. So a really good example of that was the airport's national policy statement, which we all know became very controversial in February of this year when the Heathrow expansion was found, or the NPS was found not to allow the Heathrow expansion to take place. And one way or another, the whole project fell apart. Whether it would have fallen apart in March with the pandemic is a separate issue that we would never know the answer to quite. And the NPS fits in with what the regulators then tell the various agencies to do. So you have a whole range of regulators who set tone, and they've been increasing over the last 3 or 4 years, been setting a more strident pro-carbon abatement tone. And then we have the actual sort of government quangos who run infrastructure, some of whom are public bodies like Highways England or Network Rail, some of which are private like Heathrow or the water companies and most of the generators. And then for public procurement, we have the Green Book, which, as Matthew said, has been reasonably improved recently and going very much in the right direction. And then we come down to the project. And the critical thing is actually, do we know if a project is net zero? And the problem is when you come down to the very granular project stage, we can sort of assess them. And I'm going to talk about that in my next slide. But the critical thing we need to understand, though, is it truthful? We've got lots of organizations declaring that they're net zero, but fundamentally net zero only comes down to the emissions that we make at a planetary level, whether we're emitting or consuming more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And therefore each project, it can be very difficult to see what their contributions are. And even very major projects actually come down to being quite small ones. But actually, if we take a series of steps to put us in the wrong direction, and we don't take enough steps in the right direction, we're going to fundamentally fail. So this whole sort of panoply of organizations and policies need to be very clearly understood. And actually, as Matthew said earlier, need to point much more strongly in the towards making projects better. Hopefully you can see my third slide. Sarah, rescue me if it's not. How we should evaluate projects. Excellent, thank you. First of all, I think it's always worthwhile thinking about what we're trying to do with infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure is the backbone of our civilization, and fundamentally it should be about producing happy, healthy, prosperous people, and we're all people, and we believe in Western democracy, which means we actually look out for every individual as part of that as well. We're not prepared to take liberties with individual liberty, pardon the pun, or pardon the double use of the word, for the greater the good. We actually want to make sure everybody can be happy, healthy, and prosperous. And for that, we need a just and sustainable society, partially because that is the right thing to do, but actually we need people to vote for it as well. It's really interesting that the Gilets jaunes protests in France a year ago were actually against carbon taxes. So we need to make sure we don't let society feel left behind by this, or any part of society. And in terms of actually how we evaluate an individual project, obviously Green Book's always been very good at doing cost-benefit analysis, but actually doesn't do enough about vision. And we need vision now to make sure we do enough of the right thing. Each project by itself, as I said before, might be relatively insignificant, but actually we need a vision and policy to get us to the right place. And the government's 10-point plan takes us a large part in that direction, but not fully. And I'm sure we're going to discuss that in the questions to follow. We also need to look very strongly, I think, at the contribution to carbon abatement. And we talk about mitigation, and Matthew alluded to PAS 2080, the critical things we need to do on a project level to make sure that in whole life terms, they put us in the right direction, but also adaptation, what happens if they don't put us there? And I'm sure Louise is going to cover some of these in her talk very shortly. And within this is actually impact on social value and impact on natural capital. I've shown two drawings here. One is actually of the high-speed 2 rail network. High-speed 2 should be a major transformational project towards putting us toward net zero. It's absolutely a key part of what we should be doing. But currently, the EIS for HS2 doesn't show this. It shows it actually absorbs carbon, because the other policies that are required to enable it to be transformational and carbon in the full extent aren't in place, like a national freight policy, etc. So I fully believe that HS2 will be a major transformational project, but actually we need other policies to go in place to make sure we can get the full carbon benefits. And I'll probably talk about against carbon for a stage. The slide below shows the Highways England road network. It shows all the motorways and trunk roads around the UK that actually allow our goods to travel around the place via carbon emitting vehicles. A big blank on this graph is actually around Lincolnshire. You can see sort of a big space of white. I'd actually vote for a new road to go into Lincolnshire to bring prosperity there, and we actually all will take a bigger carbon hit elsewhere in the economy to make sure that Lincolnshire is brought fully into the rest of the UK economy, so that people see a proper future there. So being a bit more controversial here, we need to spend our carbon wisely towards that just and sustainable society, which involves us actually being fair to everybody, and not just basic people with good infrastructure get stuck with it. We need to actually invest in other infrastructure to make sure no one gets left behind as well. So with that, that's the end of my quick talk. Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much. And some really interesting concepts around the fact that part of the real challenge that we've got here is that we've got to work out what we're going to do, not stop doing everything. We can't put our heads in the sand and say, no, we're not going to build anything, because of course that is the foundation of a strong economy on which we can all build and develop. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to hand over to Louise Carver, formerly from the University of Lancaster, who was involved in supporting the task force early on the year, looking at the environmental impact chapters. So Louise is going to talk us through some of those aspects now. That's okay. Is that okay, Louise?
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I will share my screen. Just have to bear with me. Can you see that?
Not yet. Don't know about anyone else.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
Great, there we go.
Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you for having me, Matthew. And actually, I should say I still am at the University of Lancaster, just currently on secondment to Parliament at the moment, looking at sustainable land management. But as Sarah mentioned, yes, I was brought in very early in this whole process, earlier this year, to look at the role of environmental impact assessments and how they were responding to greenhouse gas emissions assessments, and then of course downstream mitigation requirements. And environmental impact assessments are well established and legally required environmental decision-making tools that can play and should play a really key role in this process going forward. The question is, what role are they currently having? So I did some quite substantial research with two colleagues from the University of Lancaster, and we will be hopefully drawing some of this up into a working paper that will be published on the IC website shortly next year. So I'm just going to present a little bit of an overview. So I think the first thing worth mentioning, and that what became clear when I took a kind of horizontal look at environmental impact assessments, is that they really are just one cog in a whole system that has very strong downstream implications for how a project is run and the decisions that are made and the management outcomes, of course. And then they're also very dependent on a whole range of upstream processes, many of which Tim has just talked us through, which is in fact quite a complicated policy landscape, which urgently needs updating. But I think what is really important to see is that net zero needs to be thought about as a very holistic system and streamlined through the entire process, every step of the journey. And environmental impact is only one of them. But at the moment, they're only as strong as the wider system that is supporting them. And although they are a small cog in the system, it's a very important one. But it won't work if the other cogs in the system are weak or broken. And at the moment, what became clear was that because there's lacking upstream policy framework, that actually a lot of burden is being put down onto the environmental impact assessment mechanism. And actually that itself isn't fit for purpose. So there's a streamlined system that needs to be upgraded. So what we did with some colleagues is we really wanted to look at how carbon chapters were being produced and how the environmental impact assessments on nationally significant infrastructure projects were working. And as many of you will be aware, that some of the only guidelines for EIAs with greenhouse gas emissions arise from IEMA's 2017 guidelines called Assessing Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Evaluating Their Significance. So we took 7 nationally significant projects and coded each step of the IEMA guidelines according to how well we thought that they were actually addressing the criteria that were set out in those guidelines. And what you can see in this table is the sectors down on the left. So we have 4 transports, 3 of which are roads, and 3 energy projects. And then along the top, we have the different steps in the IEMA 2017 guidelines. I think some of the main findings that came from this was that there was a real lack of consistency. So as much as I think 77% of them all actually mentioned IEMA, using IEMA guidelines, but there was a huge amount of variability in how they were actually following these criteria. So there was a lot of interpretation, I think, that was arising from ambiguity in those guidelines over what was necessary and exactly how to follow those steps, the degrees to which they had to be followed, of course. Defining significance, the significance of emissions that are arising from a project was amongst the weakest, and that falls towards the end of the process. And that isn't really surprising, since significance absolutely is dependent on having carbon budgets in place within which one can find what is significant and what isn't. So if those carbon budgets aren't there, there is simply no way of defining significance, although many will have a go. There's lots of sectoral differences between people who use environmental assessments and the guidelines. So what was very obvious is that roads were coming out much stronger than other projects. This is probably because of the Highways England design manual for roads and bridges, which is a standard that sets out much stronger guidelines and mandates particular steps and criteria that impact assessments have to follow. And this mirrors very strongly from what I heard from conversations that I had with consultants, was that there may need to be a sector-specific mandated and standardized guidance or professional body that is set up for net zero, much like there's the Institute for Air Quality, because at the moment IEMA is not topically specific enough to be covering net zero. So there's a kind of institutional question there. The other question is that, well, there's an old adage that says you can't manage what you don't measure. And so there's this sort of imbalance between what gets assessed and what gets managed. Now, assessments leading into very good, strong management processes downstream. And at the moment, it's really not clear that that's the mitigation, reporting and monitoring steps within the whole impact assessment sequence fall towards the end of this table. And they were the much weaker areas than up front, which is around setting baselines and actually doing the calculations themselves. That was a much stronger process. That there was much less commitment and strength around doing mitigation and setting up monitoring commitments. And so the question is, have environmental impact assessments and greenhouse gas emissions become sort of reporting for the sake of reporting? You know, are they becoming ends in themselves? And in what has become a cumbersome and potentially processual industry, which needs reviewing. The other finding was that, of course, there's very strong path dependencies in all of this. So the impact assessment is linear, but it's also holistic. So each stage in the sequence depends on the quality of the previous one, meaning that if there's absences or weaknesses earlier on in the assessment process, later steps become impossible. And all of this is to say that, of course, the wider sequence within which environmental impact assessments fall is very important, and that the kind of wider regulatory and institutional framework that Tim mentioned. And so what I wanted to talk about as well is that I conducted some very, very rich conversations with various consultants who are involved and indeed clients who have to do these assessments and go through the process. And these are just some of the quotations that were coming back, but there was a few thematics that I just wanted to talk through. One was that there's a huge inertia in the system and things are changing, but it's very slow. Tim mentioned this Heathrow problem, which came about from the out-of-date national policy statement that was produced after Paris had been set with its new 1.5 degree target. And I think the other thing worth mentioning is that there may be some misunderstandings around the net zero modelling that is set towards 2050, which actually require, the whole model is very dependent on extremely deep and sweeping emissions reductions today. So there really isn't any time to lose, even if there is a 2050 deadline. The other thing that we've talked about extensively is the upstream policy frameworks are lacking. We talked about these absent national policy statements, which are out of date. There's a question for the role of strategic environmental assessments that could really help shape planning processes, and as Tim mentioned, sort of spatial planning questions, so that there can be wise decision making much further upstream, which will take much pressure off downstream planning processes that are quite weak. Planning, regulation and strengthening of the regulatory process, there's need for carbon budgets. And strengthening all of these other areas would take pressure off the EIA as a mechanism. I talked about the fact that the timing of the assessment in the wider project is often coming too early in the project to have all the final detail and the specs that will be necessary that could be streamlined through the whole process. So it's quite difficult if EIAs are being used to assess projects that are only at the outline stage that don't have all of the other details in place. The other question is this issue around defining the significance of the emissions, which at the moment is very difficult to do without budgets in place, and the relationship between proportionality and the whether or not projects are actually clearing that threshold of proportionality of having to go through a very rigorous emissions assessment, because there's this risk that if the project doesn't clear it, then we're going to be facing a death by 1,000 cuts, because obviously this is a cumulative issue. And procurement, then they're not going to they're going to go unaccounted for. And the other big thing that came across is just, what does net zero really mean? There's a definitional issue here, because it's a target that's set at a very aggregate scale. So what does it mean for each sector, for example, for each region? Is it geographic or is it at a project scale? And then, consequently, which infrastructure sectors will be required to decarbonise more strongly, and how will the budgets reflect this, and which kind of challenges will they throw up? So I think what I wanted just to mention finally is that this really is a budgeting challenge. The word net in net zero is an accounting mechanism. Net zero is like any other management process or budgeting management process that relies on a whole system of standards, tools, and social norms. Commercial budgets, for example, use specialist software, spreadsheets, policies, standards, agreements, expertise, and transparency. And anyone who's ever managed a budget knows that it's more than simply monitoring numbers, but instead a whole system of social practices and the technology that supports the quality of those numbers, the way that people manage them, and who is accountable for them, and which templates and accounting assumptions they use, and which uncertainties are foregrounded or concealed. But most importantly of all, it's what kind of management decisions and actions do those numbers lead to. And at the moment, we could say that we have something like 50 or more versions of Excel sheets with different formats, equations, unit scales, rules, and layouts used across different kinds of hardware with users who may not all align on the terms of engagement, which is being used towards managing a single budget, so it doesn't really work. So I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks very much, Sarah.
Louise, that's an absolutely fascinating place to have ended your talk around budgeting and the challenges and the compatibilities we're going to need to get to in order to make this all stack up. So definitely food for thought around that. Thank you so much for taking us through your work in terms of the EIA and the impacts that has on our path. So thank you. Finally today, in terms of our conversations from speakers, we thought it was very important to hear the perspective of a client who was trying to make the right decisions around the challenges within the infrastructure sector. So with that in mind, we've asked Daniel Johns from Anglian Water to come and join us and give us some insights from his perspective, which I think are going to be quite different and really quite useful. Daniel, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I'm just sharing my screen. Hopefully that will pop up in presentation mode. Just 1 second. I hope that's working for everybody. And thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Matthew, for inviting me to speak. What I'd like to cover just very shortly, very quickly, is the work that the water industry is doing as a kind of sector-wide initiative to achieve net zero by 2030. This is on the back of some work going back, essentially to the 1990s. So Matthew mentioned the kind of groundbreaking speech by Margaret Thatcher to the United Nations back in the late 1980s. Certainly we've been thinking about climate change for more than 20 years and just wanted to pick out a couple of other highlights as well in terms of our carbon journey as a company that's tried to lead both on the kind of the need to mitigate climate change, to reduce our emissions as far as possible, but also to prepare the east of England for the climate change impacts that we're already beginning to see. We see ourselves not just as a water company anymore. We see ourselves as an energy company. We see ourselves as a climate adaptation company. We see ourselves as a natural capital company, which is perhaps what I'll get on to toward the end of this short introduction to what we're doing. It's also worth noting that we were one of the companies that worked with governments and other parts of industry to develop PAS 2080 in 2016. And in fact, we were the first company globally to be verified against PAS 2080 in the carbon management of infrastructure. We also kind of set in 2016 a pretty ambitious target, it felt like at the time, to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 on the back of our strategic direction statement that came out the following, was updated the following year. And as I say, it's part of a water industry-wide commitment, a sector-wide commitment that was made last April. We've now tightened that target to achieve net zero, not by 2050, but by 2030. And 2 weeks ago, we published the route map. Water UK published the route map on behalf of the industry that set out very clearly how we are going to get there. We've also been making our own progress. We set targets first in 2010, both for reducing our operational emissions and for capital carbon. We were incentivized through the regulatory system to reduce capital carbon. We're really pleased that we managed to reduce our capital carbon by 62%, which again, I'll get into exactly how we've done that later on. So the net zero route map, and I want just to emphasize how kind of groundbreaking this is. So this is a whole sector coming together to produce a route map to getting to net zero, not by 2050, but by 2030. So that's 2 full decades ahead of the government's legally binding target for mid-century. And as far as we can tell, this is the first example of a sector-wide route map anywhere in the world. And we are talking obviously as part of COP26 to the Race to Net Zero campaign, and we hope the water industry will feature very strongly as part of events leading up to Glasgow next year. What that looks like, I mean, there's a summary report on the website, on the Water UK website, as well as a very detailed technical annex, the actual route map itself. But it shows that the water industry is responsible for something like 2.5 megatons of CO2 equivalent, so greenhouse gases. But where that comes from is really quite significant. First of all, as you can imagine, we use a lot of electricity. Anglian Water is one of the largest users of energy, largest users of electricity in the east of England because it's so flat. Everything has to be pumped, both water and wastewater. There's very little gravity to make use of, and so our electricity bill is absolutely enormous. And we've already managed to make really big strides in reducing those bills, and also kind of the managing risk of price fluctuations through investing in our own wind projects. Not so much at the moment, given the planning regulations pretty much foreclose those opportunities, but also solar farms. So we've got one of the largest kind of subsidy-free solar farms now in the country. But I just wanted to highlight one particular issue, which is, as you kind of follow down the chart, you see a bar that's in different colours, so methane and nitrous oxide coming from process emissions in our wastewater plants, our water recycling centres, because that's a real challenge for us. The route map was grounded very much in a bottom-up scientific assessment of where our emissions come from and what options that there are available to us to reduce them. And process emissions is going to be the really tricky one, which is why partly I was keen to do this talk, because we're going to need the expertise of engineering consultants within the UK and around the world to help us resolve that, because as far as we can tell, nobody's got a sensible and cost-effective answer for reducing process emissions from wastewater. And if we get to the pathway itself, this is actually one of 3 pathways published in the Net Zero report. It's a technology-led pathway. I'm not going to expect you to see and read the chart, it's very small text, but certainly you can see that in the middle of that pathway, you've got a light brown kind of wedge of emissions that we know we need to reduce, that's all coming from process emissions from wastewater. So in order to get to net zero by 2030, we are going to have to tackle process emissions one way or another. And what we don't want to do is to resort to offsetting. There could well be some offsetting, at least by 2030. But throughout the route map, the principle is, first of all, to reduce your own emissions, to do as much as you can to generate your own renewable energy and to export that as far as possible, become a net exporter of clean energy. But of course, offsetting through local kind of natural capital markets, local sequestration projects, through peatlands, through biodiversity, through coastal processes and so forth. That is an option, but we'd much rather reduce emissions in the first place. So that brings me to my challenges, really, as a kind of challenge to the industry, to the engineering consultants on this call, to others out there. Help us resolve this big issue with process emissions. And say we've got 10 years to reduce this as far as possible. Anglian Water alone has more than 1,000 of these water recycling centres around the east of England. It's going to be obviously a multiple of that when you get into the UK. And of course, the sector could be absolutely massive if you multiply that around countries around the world. So capturing that methane, potentially even using it as a useful resource, would be absolutely fantastic. So one of the things that we've been doing recently is we've been working with a greenhouse provider to capture the waste heat within water recycling centres. Well, there's one just outside Norwich. And we're using that, what would otherwise be waste heat, to heat the greenhouse in a really kind of cost-effective and carbon neutral way. The greenhouse that's being built will supply some crazy proportion of the tomatoes being grown in this country. And it's a really neat example of kind of circular economy thinking, where I say what would have been a kind of waste resource being captured and reused in a way that helps us and helps then reduce our emissions as far as possible. But back to process emissions, absolutely. This is something that every water company in the country will be wanting to test, to trial, to demonstrate how to tackle this challenge. and as it's such a core component of achieving net zero by 2030. The other aspect, which we are finding obviously very important, is on the capital carbon side of things, the embodied emissions within our capital projects. And having set that target and achieved the 62% reduction to that target so far, we know that the next 10%, the next 20%, the next 30% is going to be really, really difficult. There are things that we can do to incrementally reduce the kind of carbon footprint of projects. Like on the left, we've got this carbon-free, kind of emissions-free cement. On the right, of course, we are using virtual reality, I'm sure as everybody else is doing as well, to design and to test facilities in the virtual world before you can set foot on the ground, to use kind of modular construction methods, off-site construction, reusing standard components to reduce emissions, the embodied emissions as far as possible. But we've also managed to achieve a lot of that 62% reduction by not building assets at all. And that's where the picture at the bottom comes in. This is our Inglesthorpe wastewater treatment works. It's a wetland. It's a series of 4 gravity-fed lagoons which use natural processes, reed beds, the soils, to clean the water, to strip out the ammonia, nitrates, the phosphates, before it goes back into the local chalk stream. And as far as possible, we want to resolve what we see as traditional engineering challenges, but using natural capital solutions. And that really brings me to the kind of final slide, really, thinking about how us as a company define success, and how we as a company will judge the kind of success of individual projects. So we're embedding 6 capitals thinking, got the 6 capitals here on the screen. And both in terms of our overall kind of key performance metrics as a business, it's not just about the financial performance of the business, it's also about how we obviously support and look after the health and well-being of our staff, build that intellectual capital, support social capital within our region, within the communities that we serve, and also interestingly and importantly, the natural capital. Are we investing in projects which are additive to natural capital within the region? Are we doing things which boost biodiversity? Are we doing things that capture carbon as opposed to release it? Are we improving water quality? Are we improving water resources? And the point of showing you this is that this is how we will judge projects going forward. This is how we will judge the quality of investments in that options appraisal and in the choice of those solutions. So when it comes to engineering consultancies, we want you to be coming forward with projects which score really well against these 6 capitals. It's no longer good enough just to come with us with the cheapest solution. We're looking for whole life cost, of course, but also ones which are additive both to social and environmental capital and asset value in particular. So hopefully that's a useful kind of introduction both to what Anglian Water is doing, but also the water industry. And I would kind of humbly suggest that whilst the water industry is taking the lead on this, other sectors, I'm sure, will be closely following with their own net zero sector plans, with their own route maps to get to net zero as quickly as possible. And as a consequence of that, be changing the nature of the projects that we'll be investing in the years ahead. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much for that really interesting set of insights around what the water industry is doing. And I particularly liked that last slide around challenging people to think differently and how we can all go on this journey together. Brilliant. Look, thank you all so much. Now, as Chetna posted in the chat, we now have just under half an hour to answer some questions. So if people do have questions, please post in the chat and I'll try and make sure that we get to them, if that's okay. Right. Whilst we wait for people to post a couple more, potentially, I've got a few to start with from what's been posted in the chat from the outset. The first question is, as the built environment, which currently relates to 40% of the global carbon emissions, who do you see taking the lead in terms of developing science-based targets to establish precise measurements that is recognised and certified? I think that came up in a number of different parts of the conversation we've heard. But Tim, can we hear from you and then potentially Matthew about that subject?
Thanks, Sarah. And it's a good question. And actually, I would say the built environment should own an awful lot more of that. 30 to 40% of what buildings are. If you add in power and transport, it's probably 70, 80%. Rachel Skinner in her presidential address said 70%, which was based on a sort of rough global figure of what sort of built environment sort of owns. So we actually are much more culpable than the questioner asks, and we have an awful lot of work to do. But also in a way, we have more levers to use. So obviously we can reduce the capital carbon in what we do, and Daniel alluded to that, and that's a very easy challenge to do that we should be at already. A number of people are doing very well. Anglian's got some brilliant data which shows what they've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. But actually, I think when you come into whole systems thinking, then it becomes much more complicated. So we need to have a transport network. Transport has been a total laggard in the whole sort of zero carbon thing. It's barely moved since 1990. Actually, until about 2017, it was actually showing an increase in CO2 emissions over the period. And it's now started dipping back down again very slightly. But when you think about very different ways of doing things, which come back down to EVs, drawing power from a decarbonised network, we need to decarbonise our electricity network and get lots of EVs, and that's in sort of the government 10-point plan, which is good. There's things to do in home insulation, which is a huge problem. I mean, there's 27 million homes in the UK, never mind everything else. Obviously, all of them existing, most of them actually very old, and that's a huge challenge, especially in days like today, which are absolutely freezing. And I'm sure most of us have got our heating turned up far too high in terms of things. So we won't do a poll on that afterwards, but we know you're burning lots of gas in your various places. And so huge thing on insulation, and that's barely touched on the thing. They mention about insulation and buildings, but there's a vast industry to be created, which will cost a fortune, and we need to work out how that industry gets set up, etc., etc. So when we go through everything, sorry, in terms of projects, PAS 2080 is the key. So PAS 2080, I was also involved along with Anglian Water and others in the very beginning, and it was set up to be an orthodoxy of carbon calculators. Before PAS 2080, I believe there was 400 different calculators in the UK. So it meant that you couldn't actually compare an Anglian Water embankment with a Thames Water embankment, with a Highways England embankment, with a Network Rail embankment. Now we've got one common currency, which is a huge step. But the actual answer is who takes the lead? If you go back to the infrastructure carbon review in 2013, it said everybody's got to take a lead. Before that, we're all waiting for somebody else to take a lead. Consultants were waiting for clients to ask, contractors were waiting for consultants to specify, material manufacturers were waiting for contractors to demand. But actually, there's no silver bullet, there's no magic person who controls everything. It's very Wizard of Oz-ish. There isn't that person pulling all the strings and doing everything. We all step up to the plate and do the whole thing. And science-based targets will be a large part of it, actually having proper rigorous numbers that we know fit. I think Louise mentioned about the problems of measurement, and I agree with that absolutely.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. That really is a great set of insights. Matthew, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to come in, and I gather when I was speaking earlier there was some sound problems, so I'm trying to speak a bit louder to solve that, so let me know if that's a problem again. I think it's at two levels, isn't it? I think, you know, we have to have at a sort of system level an agreed national framework of pathways that cover the whole economy. Tomorrow we're going to see the Commission on Climate Change release their 6th carbon budget advice to government, and my sense is within that they're going to have some quite detailed pathways sector by sector. Now people may debate the detail and the government may come up with some alternatives, but I think we have fairly quickly, we have to get to an agreed framework which will help sort of scope and scale, I think, the specific targets sort of for different parts of the economy. Then I think you get into the question of sort of, you know, precise measurement and assurance, and I think it's a combination of using tools like PAS 2080 as both Tim and Daniel mentioned, but also then sectors taking the lead, and I think the water sector is a good example of this, where there are specific challenges around understanding and measuring particular emissions within the sector. I think you need a sort of sector-wide approach to do that.
Thanks, Matthew. That's super. So it is. Now, someone else has asked a question, and I'm not quite sure, if I'm honest, who best to refer it to. It says, how can we encourage manufacturers to publish their EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration figures? It makes it difficult to know the true net zero impact as a consultant when we're not aware of the impact manufacturers that we specify are making. Is that one from Matthew? I think it's all, it's potentially part, or Tim. I'm not quite sure which one's best answering that.
I might give it a go if you want to. I mean, basically, it's supply and demand. I mean, if we all actually demand not just EPD figures, but actually good EPD figures, it'll change things. Ideally, government would regulate it, so a bit like fridges and things like that, everything had it. I think in BIM world, where everything has to have a set of characteristics associated with every component, it would be absolutely bonkers if carbon wasn't one of those figures. So I think it should be pressure from every single angle. I mean, we talk about regulation and client demand as the two extremes, and if we should regulate to make sure everybody talks about the embedded carbon in their products, even consultancy, I would love us to actually work out between different consultants what is our carbon overhead and what we're doing, but also even to some extent, even we should be challenged to make sure the projects we work on have got a really, and this is where it gets really complicated because what's the baseline, but we all should be telling a really good carbon story. But I mean, if a manufacturer is not prepared to publish their figures, then I'd be very dubious. And I think we'll get to that point where there just will be very low demand for them, partially because they just won't fit into the BIM model. It's also worthwhile thinking BIM in 2015 only came in because government said that was the direction of travel. There was no regulations about it, but they said as a client for 30% of UK construction, they would demand it. And again, I think government's weight in this angle is actually very good. Cabinet Playbook's just been published during this call. I'm itching to have a look at it. I'm hoping there's some really positive things in there from government as the biggest client in the country.
Excellent. Yeah, and to be honest, it's so much of what you've just said are thoughts in my own mind. We need to make sure that they're not necessarily stories, but truths. It's always, it's always that challenge. So it is. Louise, in your, in the report, we concluded that based on your research, we should reform the EIA carbon chapters to avoid people scoping out some of this and ensuring that we actually require carbon mitigation, not just measurement. What actual measurable impact do you think that would have in the coming years if we actually made that happen? You need to unmute. Sorry.
Well, I think it could have an enormous measurable impact. I think really it's the one thing that's connecting the EIA, which is why I emphasized that it was a hinge, because it is the mechanism that's allowing the planning system and the policy framework to speak to practitioners and project managers. And it is the thing that in fact supports compliance. And so as much as Tim has talked about the sort of, the social value of infrastructure is obviously absolutely inherent to society and civilization. There's a huge sort of social license to operate, but the wider system that enables it to maintain that social value, I think, has to be strengthened so that it really can deliver on that particular role that it wants to play in society, which is being part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so I think it has to be supported in order to be able to do that, because it can't just do it on its own, because it is about aligning actually very different interests that the market won't do for it. And so I'm glad also, Tim, that you mentioned, yes, there's a supply and demand aspect, but also there's a sort of strong regulatory aspect too, and everything has to work together in this wider system. So it should and could have an enormous role to play. But I think the other thing worth mentioning is that we've seen for the past 10 years that the regulatory systems of the country across every aspect of society practically have been completely eviscerated. I mean, we see it in the natural environment. Most local planning authorities don't have an ecologist with which they would begin to start analysing the kind of net gain requirements, which have now in fact been mandated. So there's a sort of institutional cavity as well within that regulatory department that will actually support this, and that is a bigger political question, but one that perhaps isn't as foregrounded as strongly, but is absolutely essential for all these other parts to work together.
Thank you, Louise. That's the real challenges there, as you've identified. So much to do to try and actually get us to tie this together, and, as you say, bring in the right regulations so that we can't have people scoping out stuff and we actually all step up to this. Daniel, just a question for you. How are, a question that somebody else has raised, how are Anglian and other water companies working with the supply chain, particularly SMEs, to get to net zero?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as I say, it's clear that we're not going to be able to achieve the targets that we've set ourselves, whether it's net zero by 2030, but also I should have mentioned that we set ourselves a new target for reducing capital carbon, embodied carbon, by 70% by 2030, which is also going to be incredibly challenging. But what we've done, as a company, we've had a series of strategic alliance kind of partnerships with major engineering consultancies and whole consortiums of through the supply chain, to deliver core aspects of our infrastructure, our metering program. We've got a new strategic pipeline alliance to build a massive kind of new water main to move water from the kind of western north of our region down to the south and into the east. And as I said, we judge everything on this kind of six capitals basis. And our relationship with suppliers, including SMEs, is based around how much carbon they can help us save, as well as how much money they can help us save. And there are incentives within those relationships to make sure they're bringing forward low carbon options. And so we've been able to make really big strides in the last couple of years, not just by building assets that themselves embody less carbon, but also by just not building assets at all, by doing things really quite differently through nature-based solutions or other types of service solutions, thinking about how we use data, artificial intelligence to just manage our existing assets much more intelligently, and say other aspects, so that where in the past we might have kind of built something, traditional engineering, lots of chemicals, lots of steel, lots of carbon, to do things differently, so that we're using, say, things like soils and bugs and reed beds and things like that to solve the same problem. Just on the previous question, if I may, I think what's really important about the regulatory system, which Louise says, both at the local level, the kind of the real skills shortage there is around nature and biodiversity within the planning system, but also at the national level. And we were really pleased to see in last week's National Infrastructure Strategy from the Treasury that they themselves recognise that the regulatory system isn't working. It isn't kind of squaring up to these long-term 21st century challenges of population growth, climate change, and restoring nature. And they're going to be developing a policy paper in the next 12 months, which will hopefully reset the system, and potentially also a kind of cross-sector super strategic policy statement that got to guide the kind of regulatory approaches being set by individual government departments and by individual regulators. So we thought that was a really welcome move, not specific to the water industry, but overall about how we shape utilities, how we shape regulation for the challenges that we have.
Thanks, Daniel. And indeed, that point was something that we discuss regularly in the course of the meetings of the task force, is how we actually tie things together so that it's not so siloed and broken up. It's a real challenge, actually, in moving the dial quite substantially. Now, here's a question that's come in, and I think actually I'm going to just quickly whip around in the order that you spoke and ask you each to respond briefly. It says that many infrastructure projects are influenced by public acceptance, particularly when they're publicly funded. But much of the public have little interest on a project level, and yet have an interest on a national level. How do we get the public better engaged with local projects and understand the truth around the impact? So it's around public perception, how we change that. Matthew, and then Tim, and then Louise, and then Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. It's a tough one, this, because you have the situation where a lot of local authorities are declaring climate emergencies and appointing climate change officers and want to be seen to be doing things in the local community. And there's a question that says, the public in most cases are broadly supportive of action on climate change, but find it hard to sort of make that link to the local level. I think some of it has to happen behind the scenes. So part of the role of the consultancies and the engineers and the clients is to make sure that projects are low carbon, trending to zero carbon, without people even seeing the difference in terms of the quality of the output. I think there may be as well there's something around the sort of new techniques of sort of virtual engagement and the work that's being done by a lot of infrastructure developers and consultancies to bring projects to life more at the sort of planning stage, and that's partly obviously about helping people understand the local environmental impact, but I think maybe there's something there about helping people understand the carbon impact and how that can or has been mitigated as well.
Thanks, Matthew. Tim, what are your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Sarah. And Mark, it's a very good question. I think there's a number of bits of it. So I think Matthew spoke very well about what we might do with getting more engagement, but I think there's actually some very interesting barbs in it as well. I mean, I think the public want things in principle, but not often in practice. So, and it's some really interesting things about carbon abatement. So the UK has shown huge reductions in territorial carbon emissions since 1990, but actually very little in consumptional. So while we now have a much cleaner grid, we're buying more iPads from China. So therefore other people are actually emitting for us. And when rubber hits the road and you actually come to people and say, you cannot go on holiday this year, you must eat much less red meat, I think that's where it's going to become an awful lot more contentious. So far, system level, we have to do big system level reductions to enable people to live in a much better way. If we look at the sort of carbon per head, places like Iceland or France, which have got lots of hydropower or geothermal power, lots of nuclear power, have always had much lower carbon per heads than the UK. The UK is actually beginning to compete with them as we actually get our grid much cleaner. So what we're doing at a system level is actually working really well. What people are doing at a behavioral level has barely budged. And I think that's going to be really, really, really interesting. I mean, we have sort of little microcosms of that in terms of, do you want a mobile phone mast at the end of your road? Most people, so you have a choice of better phone reception or your children are radiated. And most people sort of think and go along, actually, I'll have my children irradiated at the end of the day. I'm sorry, joking entirely, before anyone gets into 5G conspiracy theories. But actually, these little things, you end up with an awful lot of sort of mini sagas taking place around the country about actually what we're going to do at a local level. And I am hugely interested in how we're going to persuade people to make the right choices about not going on holiday, not going on several holidays by plane to long haul every year, etc. On business travel, COVID's had a really big positive impact on aspects of that. So the question is a really complicated one, and I think it's going to lead some very interesting places. But the fundamental issue is, as a country, we have not reduced our consumption of carbon since 1990, barely at all.
Yeah, and I think that is the terrifying thing, what you're saying there, and that's what I was saying at the beginning. We cannot go back to what we did before this pandemic occurred, where we all travelled all the time, everywhere. Louise, can I have some thoughts from you on how we can help public perception? And again, don't forget to unmute, please.
All right. Yes, lovely question. I mean, I think with all of these enormous transformative paradigmatic changes that we're facing, both in terms of net zero decarbonisation, but also with all of the land use changes that are coming in with the way that we subsidise our food production when we leave the EU and so on, really monumental paradigms that are shifting. And there's going to be a huge amount of bringing people up to speed. In fact, shifting our own thinking patterns to become much more integrative, understanding the connections between everything. We heard about this idea of using wetlands and ecosystems as forms of green infrastructure, rather than the grey infrastructure to do the water filtration. And this is like integrative thinking, that actually we're all on this journey together. And what I would say is that what came across very strongly within my research was that within the wider fabric is that the consultancy sector is going to be a really important knowledge broker within all of this, actually, because they're doing a lot of the work on the client side, but also I think on the regulatory and policy side too. And so there's a huge role and responsibility for a huge amount of knowledge brokering work that will happen. And I think when it comes down to having people engage with projects at a local level, I mean, again, this comes back to questions around spatial planning and sort of democratizing that. And we've heard about this idea of localizing plan making so that people can have an input and a say about what's happening at the local level. There's questions to how sort of effective that has really been. But I think that there's a danger without having that in place and without having the wider system that we've talked about in place, that actually people will perceive infrastructure projects to be a blight rather than something that's sort of absolutely essential to people's quality of life and the functioning of the economy, and that this conversation has to become a lot more public. And I think that plan making and spatial planning is going to be key within all of this. It's going to play a big role. So,
thank you, Louise. That's it is, and as I say, we just have to keep talking about it, because if we don't talking about it and then taking action, because otherwise we won't move the dial. Daniel, what are your thoughts on changing public perception?
Well, just one example. Obviously, Thames Water has been trying to build a reservoir at Abingdon for a very long time, and running into difficulty, partly because of the regulator wants to shift the costs onto future generations, but partly because of the public acceptance of having a large reservoir kind of in their back garden. We also need to build reservoirs within the east of England, given it's the driest part of the country. But we've taken a slightly different approach in trying to build a kind of multi-sector approach, so that it's not just the water company who says we need to build a reservoir, but it's also the farming community that says we need to build a reservoir. It's also the energy sector that needs to build a reservoir. It's also local businesses, food manufacturers. This will be, the first one down the track will probably be in South Lincolnshire, probably need one also somewhere in Norfolk as well. But in both cases, they will be multi-sector water resources, serving the east of England, rather than say just the water company. And kind of going beyond that, given as said, what we're trying to do through our kind of 25-year strategic direction statement is to kind of prepare the east of England for climate change, for the impacts of climate change. Water resources is one aspect of that, but biodiversity and nature recovery is another. And so in building these reservoirs, we're also thinking about how can we manage flood risk within the east of England at the same time? How can we unlock development in places like Wisbech, which at the moment is being held back because of quite high levels of flood risk and housing development, infrastructure development. Perhaps one of the reasons why they haven't built so many roads in Lincolnshire is because of the levels of flood risk that are there. But if you can think about these problems from a social, from an environmental, from an economic point of view in one go, you might come up with different solutions. And we think an integrated water management approach to managing both the water scarcity challenge and the flood risk management challenge could well unlock some of these economic development opportunities.
Brilliant. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Matthew, sorry.
Yeah, just to follow up on the sort of public behaviour point which Tim was emphasising. I think it's quite interesting that the current Committee on Climate Change pathways that they've published sort of previously are based pretty much on fairly small levels or very little public behaviour change. And it's the pathways show how you can sort of grind your way to net zero by investing in the physical assets and changing them. But I think they're going to publish, this may be part of what they publish tomorrow, or if not, it's coming fairly soon, some alternative scenarios where there is a lot of public behaviour change and people eat a lot less meat and travel a lot less, to show the impact that will have on the sort of investments that would have to be made. And I guess particularly sort of as we look beyond COVID, that may trigger some sort of wider public awareness discussions about, okay, if we were willing to change behaviour, actually it will be much easier and there'll be less investment needed in new assets as part of the transition. So I think that could be quite an interesting angle to watch out for.
Absolutely excellent. That was really brilliant to bring that point in, Matthew. So yeah, now I think the reality is that we're out of time. Many thanks to you all for joining us and for listening to the launch of the report today. We hope that you found it interesting. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Matthew Farrow, to Tim Chapman, to Dr. Louise Carver, and to Daniel Johns. We really, really appreciate the time that you've put into this, and also the work that was done in supporting the development of the report. Just a reminder to those listening that we've recorded the webinar, and we'll send you a link later today so that you can listen to it again and forward it to colleagues. There was a link to the report pasted in the chat, and again, that will come out as part of this afternoon's email. It's clear to me that our industry has a central role to play in averting a global man-made climate catastrophe. We hope the report is a first step towards unlocking the innovation and the thought processes that our industry will need. If it's to play the central role that society expects of us in this area. More than other sectors, our industry's role is going to be critical if we're going to win the battle. But it's only going to happen, as we've just been saying in that last set of questions, if we all get involved, from large companies to SMEs to individuals, each and every one of us, to lead by example and to be the change. Thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. All the best.